I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn,
and this is Outside My Window.
During the summer of 1987, a trilogy of wartime-themed productions were put on at the Ark. The success of the summer season wartime musicals led to the creation of 440 Productions and Wartime Heritage Association. 440 Productions would lead to the Wartime Heritage Association taking the show on the road, including taking it to England, where they were able to go and perform these shows in front of World War II veterans and their families. We're speaking with Glen Gaudet, co-chair and treasurer of the Wartime Heritage Association, from his home in Halifax. Glen, just give us a bit of a background. I don't think a lot of our listeners will know you, quote unquote, from the work that you've done. So maybe give us some background of how the Wartime Heritage Association came about and what your goals and objectives are.
Sure. My involvement actually kind of covers the background of it. Initially in high school, I was one of the cast members in George Egan's drama program. So the English course had a drama component at the high school where we usually put on a fall production and then a spring theater production. And in the early days, it involves maybe a really simple Remembrance Day presentation where we did maybe half a dozen tunes from World War I or World War II, a mix of both, as a one-day event. And those stage shows evolved. George, prior to being at the high school, had already done the summer programs at the Ark, where he did much more elaborate stage shows involving World War II, stories about the sailors, the airmen, and the soldiers. And after doing that school production for a number of years at the Ark, we decided that we should take it on the road. I think someone in the audience said, "This is great. You should take this on the road. People will enjoy it." And that year, we decided we would look at doing the show in England, but also do shows across Nova Scotia. So for 2 or 3 years, we partnered with Nova Scotia Legion branches, and the shows were songs from the war, maybe as many as 40 or 50 tunes from the war years, mixed with vignettes or stories that we had gathered from vets. Some of it was history of Yarmouth and the wartime history of Yarmouth, and some of them were from direct interviews with veterans. And we did it in Legions across Nova Scotia. We did it in Bedford and Chester Basin and Windsor, and partnered with Legions, partly just to get the show out to them, to veterans in Nova Scotia. And that project also helped us to fund taking the show to England for vets over there.
And how well was it received?
In both Nova Scotia and England, it was great. England was a little different because in Nova Scotia, the reception was fantastic. But in England, when you start a show when you're doing war songs, Tara, who was playing the piano, she only had to hit 2 keys on the piano and the audience was singing along with the cast. So for the students, for the kids involved, it was amazing because the audience was right there with them singing along to the war tunes, and it was a little bit different in England, and maybe it's because England was a little bit closer to the war. Certainly, Canada's involvement in World War II was massive, and we had U-boats off the coast, and it's not like Canada wasn't fully engulfed in the war, but in England, I think it was so much closer to home. Every town was, or many towns in the south of England were 2 minutes away from being attacked by fighters and bombers. So I think the history there is maybe possibly a little more vivid for the people that remembered the warriors when we were doing the shows. What we didn't know who we were going to be doing the show for when we initially looked at going to England, but telegraphist air gunners trained in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia during the war. So the RCAF's Yarmouth station and the East Camp section of it, the Brits needed a place somewhere outside of England that they could train flyers. And the Royal Navy and their fleet air arm had pilots and air gunners and things that people that needed to be trained. And Yarmouth was chosen as one of 2 places where they changed telegraphist air gunners. The guys that sat in the back of the Swordfish torpedo bombers and manned the radio and manned the rear gun, they trained them just outside of Portsmouth, England, and they trained them in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And not too many people know that, but that's the 2 spots in World War II where they trained these telegraphist air gunners. So we reached out to their association in England. We got a message back fairly quickly saying we meet every year in the spring and have a little dinner and a dance they said, some of us are getting a little too old to dance, but maybe we could do a dinner theater. We could do a show on Saturday night. So we took the show there and essentially had 15 or 16 students playing telegraphist air gunners on stage with 200 telegraphist air gunners that had trained in Yarmouth 7 years prior, sitting in the audience and singing along to the tunes and even correcting the cast on some of the stories that we told. They'd sort of, like in a friendly way, they would sort of heckle the cast and correct them on little stories from the war. Um, and then the participants got to hang out with those veterans and hear stories from them directly. It was quite an experience. It's hard to put into words.
Were the students able to really appreciate what they had gotten themselves into?
I think so. I mean, the to start at the beginning of a production, sometimes the participants didn't necessarily know each other that well. We The teacher George that kind of ran the program when it was still in the school. Eventually, we took it out of the school and it became its own independent thing. But one of the goals of the project was to take students that might not necessarily know they could sing or want to sing, or might think they might not be able to be ever go on stage or do something in public like that. And to watch the development through the program was amazing. Like someone who couldn't fathom reading a piece of paper in front of a classroom at the beginning of it, and then a year later, they're singing solo in Dover, England, for an audience of 200 or 300 people. So that was there was that piece of the project that had its own benefits and value. But on the veterans end of it, obviously they knew the stories they were telling. They rehearsed their script. They knew the background. Um, but it's a whole other thing to take that to England and then to meet the vets whose story you're telling and hear those stories back, firsthand accounts of their own stories. The second or third year that took the production to England, we actually involved one of the telegraphist air gunners, Eric May, who we met at the first time we went over. He became part of the production. So one of the people that played him in the show played Eric May in Act One as a young Eric May going off to war and training in Yarmouth. And then in Act Two, we actually had Eric May come up on stage and tell the rest of his story and how his life ended up and where things went after the war. So I definitely think the participants got it. I don't have any
Had to
doubt
be an
about that.
emotional thing to be able to meet the people that you're representing in your production.
Yeah, it wasn't abstract for them. They knew exactly who they were playing and actually got to meet them. So
I mean, that to be able to connect the dots that way just had to have been a little bit of an emotional experience for them.
for sure. The other fortunate thing that happened was we were looking at one point when we were working out the script, we were looking for a story. We thought it would be nice if we could find a story of some, that connects Nova Scotia and England. And we found the story of a Nova Scotian soldier from the Truro area that went off to war, spent some time in England during training, crossed the Channel, and when they were liberating the Channel ports, he was part of he was his regiment was in that wave as they pushed up through the Channel ports and liberated them. And sadly, he died, I think, 2 days after the war ended, an accidental gunshot wound. Um, but he had a widow and a surviving daughter that he had never met that lived in England.
Wow.
Well, she actually came over from England and saw the show in Truro, Nova Scotia. And then when we did the show in England, her mother, similar to Eric May, came up on stage. So you tell the story of Kenneth Buchanan, you tell the story of this soldier, and then when you do the show in the England, you tell the audience. And tonight we have Mrs. Buchanan with us. No, I mean cast, audience, lighting booth. No, there weren't too many dry eyes in the room. That's for
Can't
sure.
imagine.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Now, once you get past the production part, have you guys kind of settled in on more of the research end of things? Is that where you are at now?
Yes, I mean the stage shows are done. We're not doing those anymore. But for a long time, we've been collecting all these stories. And through the school program too, you've got essays that were done every year by students for either for Remembrance Week or when they were studying World War II. Kids went out and interviewed their uncles and great uncles and neighbors and interviewed them and collected stories of local veterans from Yarmouth County. And we have those in addition to lots of the research that we had done on our own. So we initially started small and said, why don't we do the stories of the names on the cenotaph? We've got these names on the Yarmouth cenotaph, but those are just names. Let's do the stories of the casualties from our community. That's expanded since then, but we knew someone had to start collecting these stories and putting them together. And obviously, there's lots of other projects that do that. But for our own community, we wanted to be sure that those got captured and weren't lost.
Did you start in quote unquote numerical order? Did you start with World War One and work your way through, or were you hitting different marks as you kind of went along?
Well, for the cenotaph, I guess we started alphabetically for World War One and World War II to create the initial list and get their stories done. But it quickly became apparent when you start doing searches that there were some names missing. That when you're searching by place of birth or which regiment, and then sorting it out backwards, where did they come from? And then, oh, this guy's from Yarmouth County. This guy was born in Wedgeport. This guy was born in Port Maitland. We knew that there were names missing on the list. So we did, as far as doing their stories and making sure that they're remembered and their stories are told, it didn't matter if they were on the cenotaph or not. I know there's plans to eventually, I suspect, based on some initial discussions, that that's going to happen someday. The details aren't sorted yet, but Yarmouth will most likely fix that problem that we have, that some names are missing. But it was a lot of, in the case of who served from Yarmouth, there was no easy way to just plug into a search, please give me all the World War One enlistees that are from Yarmouth. We actually had to do it by saying what were the historic names in the late 1800s, early 1900s that would have been Yarmouth families. And it involved us going into the enlistment records for all of Canada and saying, okay, let's look at every Comeau. So in order to come up, so on our World War One list, if we have 70 LeBlancs or 80 Muses on our list of those who serve, it's because we went through 3,000 LeBlancs and manually checked every record and said, oh, once you've opened up his file, yes, he was born in Port Maitland. Yes, he was born in Hebron. That's how we constructed the list of those who served. So to get to the final number of how many served from Yarmouth County, I mean, we were able to do it with some keyword searches from some sites, but a lot of times it just involved checking everyone from that group to find the ones from our local community.
So what's the basic criteria for having your name appear on the cenotaph? Is it where you were born, where you lived most of your life? Like how does that work?
I think that I won't say I think, I'm quite sure that depends on the community and what they set up as criteria and how they did it. So, and I don't think there's any hard and fast absolute rule, and I don't think there should be. Um, in the case of the Yarmouth Cenotaph, a committee was struck after the First World War, and they reached out to the community and said, if you have someone that you think should be on the cenotaph, we want to know. And I think it was done by families writing in. The military would have had records. The local community would have had records on who served, but that's not definitive. People move away. So general guidelines, I guess, I hate to use the word guidelines, but they are a community saying these are the people we remember from the war. So for the most part, that means born in Yarmouth. But in the case of our existing cenotaph for World War One and World War Two, that might be maybe not born in Yarmouth, but moved to Yarmouth after birth and spent time studying here, grew up here, worked here for 2 years before they went off to war. Um, and with the existing cenotaph, some of those are spouses. So they may not be from Yarmouth, but they married somebody from Yarmouth. Maybe they lived here briefly before they went off, or they were stationed at the RCF Station Yarmouth base. Their wife moved to Yarmouth while they were stationed there, and they lived off base or near the base. So there are some different scenarios, but generally when we tell the story or in what we do on the website is we're not I don't know. Our site isn't deciding what exactly should be the criteria for a cenotaph. What we're saying is, here are the people that have ties to our community, either through marriage or through residency or through birth or through parents even. Some of our list include sons of people that were both born in Yarmouth that grew up here, and maybe they went off to Boston to work, and their sons served. We include them on our site because we think, as far as connections to the historic connections, that those stories should be told. So it involves a lot of genealogy work, to sort of piece those things together. But that's who we've included for the most part. Enlisted here, lived here, born here, married someone from here, or children from parents, from here, from our community.
As you were going through the thousands and thousands of lines of information, any surprises that pop out for you?
Once we had all the data, all the information collected from World War I, we have sort of gone back to it numerous times to say, like, what can we, not trends is the wrong word, but just to sort of, in looking at those lists, you really do learn a lot about the community. Family names that might have been prominent that aren't anymore, but back then were very. Um, there's trends like that you see, and it's interesting because we always talk about different generations and their connections to New England. And some people think it's more recent. I know my dad, he was born in Boston because his parents happened to be working down there. Now, he's a Korean War vet, he's not World War II, but um, so we think that's sort of a recent thing, that in the late 20s and 30s, that sometimes some Nova Scotian, and particularly Yarmouth and that end of the province, that their people would take off and go work in the summertime in New England. And certainly doing the World War I list, one thing it did confirm is that that was happening way before the 1920s and 30s. I mean, there's historic connections between New England and Nova Scotia going back to 1700s, but even with the World War I list, you saw that how many were either living in Boston when they were enlisted, but they were born in Yarmouth and they came home to serve with Canadian forces. And there's a few that, if they had been in the U.S. a bit longer, they might have just enlisted and served in the U.S. Army later, 1917, 18, when the U.S. joined the war. That piece was interesting. But there's just the other thing, in looking at the numbers, is how much World War I impacted, not just for the guys involved and the people that went overseas, but for the people back home. Because you can look at one bank on Main Street that had 16 tellers or 12 tellers, and a year later, 10 of those 12 tellers have left to go overseas, or they're in Halifax with a service battalion, or so World War I really did. It emptied the farms, it emptied the fishing boats, it emptied the
Wow.
banks, it completely. We know World War I completely changed the country and little communities, but when you look at the numbers of the enlistees and how many were gone, some gone forever in the case of casualties that we never got back, but just those that left for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years of service, it's the numbers are staggering.
So what's next for you guys? It's ongoing, I'm sure.
For
You just
sure.
keep going and going and going. But is there any other groups or projects that you've got on the horizon?
We At the moment, we're still focusing on the World War II list because we broadened it past just our Yarmouth community. We are working on a comprehensive list of all casualties from Nova Scotia in World War II. Um, the books of remembrance, that are held in Parliament in the Peace Tower, they display a page every day, and they display the names of Canadian war dead that were lost during the Second World War. Um, and there's also the Canadian Virtual War Memorial that lists those same names that appear in the books. And although the lists are very good and they're meant to be like a comprehensive Canadian list, there are names that are missing. Just like with the cenotaph, as good as records were and as best as people tried to capture all the names, they didn't. Um, so we've been working on trying to get that list to be as comprehensive as, to include as many as we want. Everybody listed there. We don't want to miss one. So that's sort of, every time we think we've got them all, you find a different way of searching,
Hmm.
or you find another subset or an archive of just submariners or just airmen that maybe they didn't enlist with the Royal Canadian Air Force. Maybe they decided to go overseas before the war even started. So they were born in Nova Scotia, but they went to England in 1937 and they joined the RAF directly. Someone in that situation is not going to have a Canadian service file. So we've tried to add, to the list is, and I hate to use the word list because the purpose of the list is to create a list so that we can tell their stories. Just having a list of names doesn't mean very much. Remembrance on the 11th, I mean, it's not intentional. No one does this on purpose, but it can sometimes be this vague sort of, we remember is a great concept, but who are we remembering? And if we don't know the stories of who we're remembering, are we remembering them? I guess is the question. In the case of World War II, when veterans went to the cenotaph, and we don't have any of our World War One veterans left. World War II, we're losing them quickly. There's
Yes.
still some, but you know, when they went, they had the first hand. They were there, so they know the stories. They don't need to necessarily be told them when they're standing there. But when younger generations go, they need to have some kind of frame of reference. They need to know the history. There's no assumed background knowledge built in there without someone imparting it to them or sharing it with them. And that's another goal of the project is to a lot of World War II stories and history seem like these far off, abstract things that you can't really connect to. And the goal is to say, this is what happened at Juno Beach. And by the way, your uncle was there or your great uncle was there. Here's the stories from our local town, from Wedgeport and Port Maitland and Hebron and South Ohio and Dayton and Brooklyn. Here's it. I think it makes it much more relatable when if that history is being told, you can tie it to your community directly and tell the stories directly from home.
Has it been tough to get the stories? I know that in dealing with veterans over the years, some of them are a little reluctant to kind of recount things that have gone on. But I mean, have you guys been successful in being able to get firsthand accounts, or are you dealing with second and third hand?
Uh, Both. And I mean, the responses and sort of people being comfortable with sharing is as diverse as the veterans that you draw the stories from. I guess some are comfortable sharing. I know in the case of my father, my brother and I, we could sit down with him and ask him questions about his time in Korea, and thankfully he shared them with us, and I've captured some of that and written it down. Eric May, that veteran, that telegraphist air gunner that we met in England, he never went to the telegraphist air gunners reunions. In his case, um, after the war, he just, I don't know, probably like I said, for every veteran's a little bit different, but it may have been too painful, and that wasn't something he did. He never joined the association. He never went to the annual reunions. But the year we were taking the show from Yarmouth, he got the newsletter from the association, and it said the the way he puts it, a bunch of kids were coming over from Yarmouth where he trained, and he thought to himself, even if I'm half dead, I'm going to get to that show and I'm going to see it. So for him, doing that stage show that first year in 2003 or 2004 brought up it was his first time coming to an Air Gunners reunion to see the show, but then we got so many stories from him, and he's been over to Yarmouth and stayed with us since, and we went over to England and stayed with him for a bit of time, and like I said, in the last year of the show, he was on stage sharing stories with everybody. So there was an evolution there for him for sure. When we took the show to England, and before we took the show to England, and we were still doing it in Nova Scotia. One of the stories we told was the Canadians that were camped just outside of Dover, just outside of Deal. We did the show in Deal, in southeast England, which isn't far from Dover, and some of the people in Deal remembered Canadians that were camped in the woods, Willow Wood, and in the woods in and around Deal. So, and in writing the script, we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could find a vet that was stationed in the Willow Wood? And we were doing the show. I think it was probably the fourth or fifth show that we did on the Nova Scotia tour. We were doing a show at the Bedford Legion, and we told a little bit of the story of the Willow Wood and the Canadians that were there. And during intermission, a World War II vet came up to us and said, I was at Willow Wood. He was from Lower Sackville, and he had been stationed there during the war. We went to his house I don't know if it was the summer after we did the show, or I don't remember the timeline, but George and I went and sat in his living room and brought a camera and recorded him and interviewed. I think we did 2 or 3 hours at his house doing an interview. And I remember going into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and his wife was just sitting in she didn't want to be bothering us, so she was sitting in a chair right next to the kitchen door, and just tears rolling down her face. And I kind of stopped and sat with her, and she said, the stories that he's sharing with you now, I've been married with him for 60 or 65 years. He's never told them to me. I've never heard any of this stuff.
Wow.
So that's an example of, I don't know, you don't know when someone's going to be comfortable telling their story. So a lot we've got from veterans themselves. A lot of them have been passed down through the community to George or George's parents, or they're from all different sources. Some of them from letters, if we're fortunate enough to have a letter. In the case of the First World War, they wrote, so you have letters that were sent home, and families will share those letters with us. We've collected some ourselves.
Over the years, have you partnered with all the different levels of legions and veterans associations and the like to try to feed that information into you, or are you just kind of building the connections as you go?
I think that's something we always should be doing more of. I mean, the stories are online, so we hope people will use the resource and go find it. Obviously, that's public to anyone that wants to go online. And social media is a way of getting the story out. There's a lot. The groups online are endless. So, in the case of some of the people from Nova Scotia that served with U.S. forces, there's the American Battle Monuments Commission in the U.S. that manages American war cemeteries, not in the U.S., but the ones that are overseas. So, the D-Day Beach
Mm.
cemeteries, the one in Manila in the Philippines. Um, the American cemeteries tended to be a lot more centralized, so they have a lot of big war cemeteries overseas. Um, the Canadians and Commonwealth, there seems to be more of them. Where the American ones, you have these massive cemeteries and memorials for those that don't have a known grave. So we've partnered with that. As far as online, we've partnered with the American Battle Monuments Commission, the U.S. Veterans Administration, and their cemeteries for burial programs in the U.S. We'll share those stories on their pages with regard to a specific cemetery. That's something I've tried to do through social media, so it's not just us on our own website, but sharing it on other people's pages, um, in specific categories or in specific topics of interest. So if this page is dedicated to all those that are interred at the specific cemetery in France, then we'll share the stories there so that it gets to people that might be curious about that topic or those stories.
When it comes to the more recent conflicts like Korea and Vietnam, have the records been easier to research through, or are they just as haphazard as the others?
Well, they're not public. So World War One, in the case of World War One, all service files are available, whether they were a casualty during the war or they served and were veterans that lived into the 50s, 60s, 70s. They're available because of the timeline, because it's been so long. They're public. So for World War One, you can access anybody's service file. In the case of World War Two, if they were a casualty during the war, those service files are available. But if they're a veteran and they survive, their service file wouldn't be available to the public. Family can certainly access it, but it wouldn't be publicly available. And Korea and Vietnam fall into that category too. So, what stories we do have from Korea and Vietnam, we, if they're casualties, we do have some information that we can get through Ottawa and through other sources. But Vietnam, we wouldn't have access to their service files as such. Only what's publicly available online that others have shared. Or
So that all being said, how do you define success for this whole program? I mean, is there light at the end of the tunnel per se? Are you anticipating at some point to kind of work yourself out of this altogether?
I mean, I really don't think so, and I think that's the nature of remembrance. Is it's going to be and it should be an ongoing thing. Um, if this has taught us anything about there's this crazy concept that history's already written. You just have to go read it, but it isn't written. A lot of it isn't written yet, or it's not known. So, and that's the same with the individual stories of the casualties. We didn't have them all. We didn't know them all. they were lost until until you find their stories. They're not really captured anywhere. So I don't see a time that we'll stop working on it. I mean, we have 1 or 2, 3 volunteers that work on these stories, and the goal was to have an individual remembrance page for every Nova Scotian casualty. Well, there's there's close to 3,000 or just over 3,000 casualties from Nova Scotia in World War II, and I think we've done about 800 or 900 remembrance pages. So that alone could keep us busy for a long, long time when you only have a few people working on their stories and you want to get the stories right. I don't have a military background, so just learning the lingo and trying to figure out what service files mean and what it says in there and how to translate that so it's readable to someone else. There's a lot of work involved in that too. Um, and you want to get the story right.
That's extremely important, of course.
Yeah. So it's an ongoing project. I don't think I don't think we can put dates on. Definitely not on the World War II list. That's there's plenty of work there to keep people busy for quite a while.
And this is a labor of love. This is a volunteer thing.
For sure. I mean, it's what I do when I'm not doing anything else. It's the default. I go back to it and then I work on another page. And it goes in waves. If we're working on a specific category, in the case where we were trying to figure out who were the Nova Scotians that were casualties who served with U.S. forces, that was a focus for a number of months. And then because we actually had a number of roughly 200 soldiers, sailors, and airmen, I worked on that until those 200 were done. And then George Egan might be focusing on something else. We might go back to World War One. You mentioned the number 2 construction battalion, and the work that was done locally is amazing to have that on Main Street now that lists all those that served in the unit. Well, once that was done, our first thought was, okay, we have to have a page for each one of those. That we need to do a remembrance page for each one of them so that if people do want to read more, of course, there's other sources to get more information on them, but we should at least on our site have a page for each of those guys so that they have a remembrance page. So then that becomes the focus for a little while. Sometimes it's things we planned, and sometimes it's something else is going on that causes us to focus on a specific category or to do specific pages on.
Interesting. Well, Glenn, really want to thank you for chatting with us today. I think this is really great. If anybody's interested in reaching out and contacting you directly for whatever reason, whether they've got some stories to share, some letters, or information that they think might be relevant to the project you're working on, what's the best way for them to do that?
The simplest, I mean, they can go to wartimeheritage.com. That's our website. If they do want to reach out by email, wartimeheritage@gmail.com is probably the simplest. And we're on X and Threads and Instagram and Facebook. They can message us on there or email directly at wartimeheritage@gmail.com.
Excellent.
I'm Gary Nickerson,
And I'm Quinn Taggart.
and this has been Outside My Window.